Welcome to Tossing Grenade the Windmills. Windmills.
Hi, my name is Matt Franklin. All right, on to the podcast. This is the novel Grenademan vs. the Zombies by T.C. Ricks. Chapter 4, Part 2. With a brilliant flash of light, Jarvi was back in the real world. The stones were at his feet. They were simple-looking enough. They were green, almost plastic-looking. They were each a foot long and 6 inches wide, and were laced with marbled white cracks and what looked almost like veins along the side. The texture had a distinct fleshy feel to it. Jarvi looked around. He found himself in a mountainous region that somehow looked very familiar. He'd never been here, but he felt like he had. What he did know was that there wasn't anything but a dirt road between him and the city just next to the horizon. Sighing to himself, he began to walk. Where was he? Why couldn't chaos have put him somewhere sane? As he walked, he found bits of armor and medieval weaponry. At first, he thought chaos had put him in some kind of European battlefield. That was until he realized that it was all plastic. The final clue was the plastic elf ear right next to the Coke Zero bottle. He was in New Zealand, and he had definitely seen this movie before. Cute. It took the better part of half a day to get back to civilization. He wasn't sure how much Doc had tried to warn people. Rationally speaking, he knew that the odds of Doc successfully convincing anyone of what was coming were essentially nil. Doc and the others didn't even believe it themselves. That didn't stop Jarvi from worrying about it, though. He also realized that he didn't have a passport. That was going to be a problem. Though, now that he thought about it, being in an out-of-the-way location with no paper trail that explained how he got there could come in handy. After all, he was planning on destroying the whole world, not just Doc and company. That was part of the deal. He allowed himself a small amount of thought as to just how much apocalypse he wanted to create. Was it really worth it to destroy the whole world just on a bet? Wasn't that cartoonish? And yet, ultimately, Jarvi didn't have any friends. He didn't have any family that he cared about. He didn't have anything he really wanted. He didn't want power or money. That was all he had ever wanted, and Doc and the rest weren't willing to give that to him. If destroying Doc and the others meant fulfilling his part of the bet, then that was what he would do. Still, how exactly was he going to destroy the world? Most people didn't really seem to think this kind of thing through. There were a lot of ideas that he would definitely be taking into consideration. The fact of the matter was, this was the real world. If he was going to rule it, then he would want the world to be something worth ruling. Of course, he had to win the bet first. That was the whole central core of his being. He was going to prove them wrong. They could not survive a zombie apocalypse, and that was all there was to it. So, he was going to do an apocalypse, and do it well. This was going to be a complete collapse of civilization, and not something that would allow small enclaves of people to hold out, eking out a semblance of civilization. No, this was going to be the extinction of all life on Earth. The scale of power he'd seen Chaos use, what he felt now that he was its minion, told him he could just as easily have destroyed the planet itself. That wasn't what it was all about. When Jarvi found a hotel, he had to use his credit card to get a room. So much for anonymity. He got a newspaper and looked it over to see if things had become international news yet. For the most part, he seemed to be in the clear until he read about the terrorist known as Grenademan. Frank Noble, a.k.a. Grenademan, has stolen a large amount of fissionable material from the Los Alamos Nuclear Research Facility. Federal, state, and local officials are on the alert. The National Terror Alert condition has been raised to red, and the National Guard has been mobilized. While that was interesting, the bit at the bottom of the article indicating that the lunatic had left a note warning of an impending zombie apocalypse worried him the most. He went down to the lobby of the hotel and did a quick internet search on one of the free computers. It seemed that Mr. Noble had entered the White House, left the note on the president's desk, and escaped unharmed, despite the flood of Secret Service agents working to stop him. Chaos had mentioned that this was a bet, and it looked like he had a foe. But how did Grenademan fit into all of this? Had Doc or Beads summoned him somehow? And what did he want with a nuke? What was he going to nuke the zombies with? That gave him a really good idea to mix with one of the 7 stones. Atomic zombies would be quite deadly. Still, he hadn't exactly received an owner's manual with the set, so he was going to have to learn by trial and error. He knew that they would follow his commands, and he knew he could fuse supernatural properties into them by touching a symbolically representative material to the stone when he activated it. But how were they going to behave? What if he wanted some of them to be mindless and some of them to retain their minds? He reached out into a small yellow backpack he called his Sunshine-ina and pulled the Protonomicon to him. He began to search it for clues. It held a few ideas, but nothing concrete. It talked mostly about philosophical things that were meant to give him some ideas about what kinds of symbols might give what kinds of properties. It looked like it was going to be his own interpretation of the symbol against what the Protonomicon, Chaos, and the stones felt, which was just great because it was now rather obvious that Chaos had a rather mischievous sense of humor. He'd found the Protonomicon after searching the world for 7 months. He'd known once the group wouldn't buy his stock in the new company he was starting that he was going to have to come up with an elaborate scheme to make them pay. He figured real magic would be the best way to do that. Money had never really been a problem for Jarvi. His parents had left him quite a bit of money for college. He'd taken half of that money and traded it on the stock market. He had a natural gift for the way the numbers went up and down. It was almost like he could put the money there, and it would grow. It was that same natural intuition that had given him the ability to translate the Protonomicon. When he had gotten to the final page of the book, he had been very surprised to find Chaos on the other side waiting for him. He'd made a deal and told Chaos about the bet that the others had made. Chaos had become very interested and had given him the help he needed to stage the first, not quite successful zombie apocalypse. After a great deal of thought, Jarvi finally came up with a plan of what to try first. He smiled grimly. It wasn't perfect, but it would do nicely. The room was dark, which felt right for a morgue. Jarvi had to use his power to lift himself to the windows and opened it with ease. He'd originally wanted it to make zombies, but the anima power was proving far more useful at the moment just to get him around. He wanted a fresh corpse, but he also wanted someone physically strong. He began to open the drawers one at a time and discovered, to his horror, that he had a small problem. Recently deceased corpses nauseated him to an extreme. He couldn't explain it. The bodies in the cemetery were more decayed than these. Maybe it was because they were so close to still being living people. Ironic, really, considering the fact that most of the population of the world he was going to rule would be dead. He had better get used to it. He figured he'd find some anti-nausea medication in a pharmacy when he was done here. One by one, he opened each of the drawers. One of the women was quite physically attractive. Necrophilia had never really been a problem for Jarvi before, but then again, he'd never really been able to use anima to make someone come to life, either. He moved her around suggestively on the table, but it didn't really do anything for him. He moved on to a large man covered with burns. This guy wouldn't be very useful for blending into the population, but if he wanted to spread his curse quickly, he would be ideal. He needed an athlete or a bodybuilder. He carefully laid one of the chaos stones on the athlete's chest and began to chant. He formed the image of animation clearly in his mind and willed it to come to life. The lights in the room slowly began to dim. Jarvi noticed that his watch went blank as well. How far did this blank-out go? The thing spasmed. The question burned into his mind about what he would mix into the spirit, and he chose the answer. Or, rather, it felt like it chose him. The image of blood appeared in his mind, and suddenly every vein and artery in the rotting corpse began to glow scarlet. The flesh turned translucent for a moment, and a beauteous gem in human form showed before him, a ruby of death. And just as quickly as it had happened, the light was gone, and the corpse rose up from the table. It didn't look as much like a corpse anymore. It almost looked alive. The eyes had a faint red glow to them. The flesh was covered like any other person one might meet on the street, and the stench had entirely left the thing. Jarvi sensed a terrible hunger in it. It wanted to eat. It wanted to feast on the flesh of the living and spread its terrible curse as far and as fast as it could. And it could move. The thing before him swayed back and forth with the rapid strength that came with rapid speed. This was no slow, lumbering corpse. It was, by his observation, indistinguishable from a terrible disease that would spread across the world like fire when the time came. He had to smile morbidly when he thought about it. Chuckles, the name he gave his undead atom, would make the scientists of the world look for a disease or a toxin of some kind, hoping for a cure. But there was no cure. This was not something natural science could comprehend. It was magic of the most primal and ancient kind, and it was his to command.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Thomas Ricks. Music by Melanie Ricks. Voices by Skip Huffman and Josie Bergen-Lawson. Copyright 2012, Red Anvil Amalgamated.
To fight the forces of evil!